I believe that one of the next great players on the world stage is going to be climate change. Calls for harsh environmental restrictions in the name of saving the environment is already being voiced by influential organizations and figures. The Red Cross proclaimed that climate change is a bigger threat than COVID. Bill Gates recently demanded dramatic measures to prevent climate change, claiming it would be worse than the pandemic. Climate change due to human activity is real, but not the way most people think, and I've divided this into 3 brief sections. First, what climate change is, what climate change is not, and why it matters, or as weathermodificationhistory.com puts it, to make you aware of the coming global governance of geoengineering schemes. If we look at the definition of climate change by the United Nations, we're going to see climate change refers to the long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns. Human activities have been the main driver of climate change, primarily due to the burning of fossil fuels. Notice the word primarily here. If the burning of fossil fuels is the primary way humans alter the climate, then what are the non-primary ways? It's called weather modification. This is any technique that intentionally alters the temperature, rainfall, cloud cover, or any other measurable change in climate or weather. And I'm going to argue that this is likely the main cause of climate change.
Get a little anxious when they hear about people sort of playing the weather god, which in a way you guys are kind of doing here.
We're not really playing God. I think that's really overstating what we're doing. Human activity affects the weather all of the time. We're being very specific and targeted and environmentally friendly in what we're doing to enhance the natural precipitation, enhance the natural process.
It turns out that some companies will pay millions to enhance the weather. Companies like Idaho Power. The company serves more than 500,000 customers with a network that includes 17 hydroelectric power plants. To them, water is money.
Let's do this.
History of weather modification goes all the way back to the 1800s with James Pollard Epstein. Epstein developed a convectional theory of storms that he presented to the American Philosophical Society, the French Academia of Sciences, and the British Royal Society. His theory was published in 1840 as the Philosophy of Storms. And only 30 years after his passing did the United States patent their first weather modification technology. Patent number 046279, a method of producing rainfall by Louis Gathman. Since then, the government has issued literally hundreds of patents in weather modification and geoengineering, and it's still ongoing today, ranging in everything from the production of clouds, right, whether they be hail clouds, rain clouds, fogs, mists, even a vortex ring generator. Many of these patents are recreations of older technology. And there are many other brand new weather modification techniques with the use of weather balloons or custom devices and satellites. These numbers that I'm flashing up are real. Just grab one and look it up. So what is climate change? I'd say this is cloud seeding, cloud ionizers, ionospheric heaters, different resonance technologies. All these things are used to change the climate.
Welcome. Greetings, gentlemen. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm a retired scientist, bachelor's, cum laude in forestry, master's in zoology, 35 years, USDA scientist, Soil Conservation Service, U.S. Forest Service, civil service equivalents in range, wildlife, fisheries, geology, agriculture, soils, ornithology, entomology, botany, mycology, hydrology. Am I qualified to speak? You want some figures? Okay, latest water test. Tested the rain. 13,100 micrograms per liter of aluminum in the rain in 2013. Normally, it should be 0. So 13,100 is pretty damn much, folks. It used to be 0, then it was 100s in the 2000s, and then since 2010, it's into the 1,000s and the latest 13,100. Okay, pH of acid soils is 20 times more alkaline. The aluminum in the soil has doubled in the last 10 years. Aluminum blocks essential nutrients. I am unable in my garden to restore normal pH, and that's because nanoparticles are now in the circulatory systems of both plants and humans.
I came here mostly as a person who's worked in the military-industrial complex, worked on F-106s in the Air Force, worked as a consultant to a variety of the top aerospace companies as a conceptual artist and a designer. I've had a secret clearance for a number of years, and I've worked on systems that are still classified today, 20 years later. I want to give you a little bit of history on the background behind nanoparticles, has been described before. A nanometer is 1/1000th of a meter. It's very small. In fact, if you have particles, say, that are 40 or 50 nanometers across, you can take and line 50 of them up next to a single red blood cell. These things are extremely tiny. They're pervasive. The Air Force conducted a study starting in 1993. It was called In Vitro Toxicity of Aluminum Nanoparticles in Rat Alveolar Macrophages. That's a real fancy way of saying testing the effect of aluminum nanoparticles on the white blood cells in the little air sacs in your lung, the alveoli. And what they found in this 8-year study was that these particles, when you're exposed to them long enough, it suppresses the ability of your white blood cells to defend you from airborne infections coming into your lungs. So it suppresses your immune system. But they also found that these same particles, once they get into your system, they can actually go through the barrier in each one of the cells. They get inside the cells, and these particles can actually suppress the ability of mitochondria, which are in the cells that help to gobble up toxins and things that will be harmful to the nucleus and the reproduction process of the cells in your body.
I was a weatherman in the United States Air Force. I was a wildlife biologist with the Department of Fish and Wildlife for 38 years. We have clouds in the sky we've never seen before. Almost every day I'm seeing clouds I've never seen before. And NASA has been even named a few of these new clouds. It's really interesting. As a wildlife biologist, I've been watching the ecosystem collapse. When you lose all your stream organisms, when you have aluminum overload in your streams, you're killing your microbial bacteria and you're disrupting the entire ecosystem. So it goes way beyond just a little bit of pollution. I would like to ask you to put a little bit of funding towards some real testing programs of snow and rain and vegetation.
That is not rain, that is not snow. Believe it or not, military aircraft flying through the region is dropping chaff. Small bits of aluminum, sometimes it's made of plastic or even talicized paper products, but it's used as an anti-radar issue, and obviously they're up there practicing. Now, they won't confirm that, but I was in the Marine Corps for many years, and I'll tell you right now, that's what it is.
This is inevitably military or something going on. The government, the Air Force, you see this kind of a pattern like this, you can rest assured there's something going on. They're actually little bitty magnetic and little bitty strips of, whether it's aluminum.
Well, it's a nuisance to you and I.
When people think of climate change, they tend to think of man burning fossil fuels or other carbon emissions. And if we say that's true, certainly weather modification is also a part of this equation. It just so happens this side of climate change is just rarely made public or shown. And to properly introduce this idea, I want to ask you a trivia question. What do weather modification technology, GPS, and cell phones all have in common? They all had their original funding and purpose as war technology. According to the U.S. Air Force document AF 2025, this was a final report on weather modification. They said that weather modification would offer the warfighter a wide range of possible options to defeat or coerce an adversary. These capabilities also extend to triggering floods, hurricanes, droughts, and earthquakes. This document further stated that weather modification will become a part of domestic and international security and could be done unilaterally. It could have offensive and defensive applications and even be used for deterrence purposes. The ability to generate precipitation, fog, and storms on Earth, or to modify space weather, and the production of artificial weather are all a part of an integral set of technologies. We could also talk about the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, or HAARP. Military Tech News called this a weapon of mass destruction that operates from the outer atmosphere and is capable of destabilizing agricultural and ecological systems around the world. Now, this isn't to say that this is all for nefarious purposes. As I said, some of this is already making it to different practical uses for the public. For example, Wall Street Journal and Reuters pointed out that in November 2009, China's Weather Modification Office started seeding clouds with silver iodide in an effort to counteract a lingering drought in Beijing. Even more recently, in 2021, Forbes wrote an article about how Dubai is using laser drones to shock rainwater out of the sky because they're having, like a season's sweltering heat. So all this to say is that yet still the main use and objective of all this technology has been for war.
Weather as a weapon. This is from Popular Science, describing in 1958 that we had then the technology to control the weather and use it as a weapon. And again, for those who hear academia telling us this is all just a proposal, something we might need to do, absolutely false. In our situation now, those in power control the spigot. They absolutely control the spigot. They decide where it rains, how much it will rain, how toxic that rain will be. Is that not literally control over life itself at that point, as President Johnson emphatically said at the beginning of this presentation?
You could actually spray sulfuric acid in the stratosphere 20 kilometers over our head and use that to stop the planet warming up in a kind of ugly tech fix.
You can spray something into the atmosphere to change. Spray
pollution into the atmosphere to stop it warming.
How do you do this?
You'd start with a fleet of modified business jets and say 20,000 tons of sulfuric acid into the stratosphere every year. And each year you have to put a little more. And this doesn't, in the long run, mean that you can forget about cutting emissions. We will need to rein in emissions.
We'll get to it eventually. But in the meantime, we're shrouding the earth in sulfuric acid.
So people are terrified about talking about this because they're scared that it will prevent us cutting emissions.
Right, and also that it's sulfuric acid.
We put 50 million tons of sulfuric acid in the air now as pollution, and it kills 1 million people a year worldwide.
Okay, but it'll be better if we put more in.
We're talking about 1% of that.
1% more, we're just killing 10,000 more people.
You can do math.
What happens to the sulfuric acid after it's sprayed? Does it just stay up there?
No, it rains down, but it's a tiny addition to what we're already doing.
Is there any possible way this could come back to bite us in the end?
It actually turns out to be an old idea. This was known since President Johnson.
You ever look at those planes up there? They have contrails behind them. Maybe all those planes with the contrails, maybe they're actually spraying chemicals into the atmosphere right now and Uncle Sam isn't telling us.
Seems extremely unlikely.
That the United States is not telling something to its citizens? That seems extremely likely to me. Read the newspaper. I think they might have your idea already.
So is it all used for good? Well, I mean, if we're using it to win wars, in some ways that may have good implications, but I don't think man's desire for power always ends up well, including this type of tech. Because what if disasters were intentionally created? What if they were played off as natural? In the very least, I want to communicate here that this is possible. Just because it can be done doesn't mean it will, but it's something to keep in mind as we start to dive in deeper.
Can you tell us what this is and what effect climate change has on this phenomenon?
Well, we can come back and talk about climate change at a later time. I want to focus on the here and now.
I'm just trying to get that. You said you want to talk about climate change, but what effect does climate change have on this phenomenon that is happening now? Because it seems these storms are intensifying. That's the question here.
I don't think you can link climate change to any one event. Okay. On the whole, on the cumulative, climate change may be making storms worse, but to link it to any one event, I would caution against that.
Okay, well, listen, I grew up there, and these storms are intensifying. Something is causing them to intensify.
As I said, most people hear climate change and think of carbon emissions by man, but how much evidence is there to support this? Let's address this here and talk about why I believe the argument that carbon emissions are the main cause of climate change is still at best debated amongst scientists and at worst, a false narrative that's used to justify violations of human rights. Now, don't misunderstand me. There are arguments to be made against pollution, deforestation, many different types of atrocities man does to the earth. We should recycle and take care of our environment. All of that stuff is true. But when it comes to the overall narrative about man's effect on the climate, that's where the conversation moves from basic moral tenets to real scientific problems. People tend to believe things at face value from authorities they trust, not things they took the time to verify themselves. Thus, he who controls the narrative really controls the masses, because it doesn't have to be true, it just has to be trusted. And once enough people are telling the same story, it basically becomes the truth. For example, it's commonly said that there is a 97% consensus that climate change is man-made. Now, people who disagree are equated as climate deniers or who simply don't want to accept the evidence. But is this true? Because on the same note, we could ask, how many of you have actually looked into that figure? This was taken from an online survey in 2009 by Peter Duran and Maggie Kendall.
Studies, as you know, Senator, in peer-reviewed scientific journals show that at least 97% of climate scientists agree that climate warming trends over the past century are very likely due to human activity.
This survey was sent to over 10,000 different scientists, and just over 3,000 of them responded. There were two primary questions. The first was, when compared to pre-1800 levels, do you think the mean global temperature has generally risen, fallen, or remained relatively constant? Question number two asked, do you think human activity is a significant contributing factor in changing mean global temperatures? Now, besides the fact it wasn't clarified what constitutes human activity or what it means to be significant, what they don't tell people is that from the 3,000 who responded, only 79 were included in their report. Now, why is that? Long story short, it's because they didn't respond what they wanted them to respond, so they narrowed the criteria to only scientists who recently published 50% of their papers in the area of climate change. So right from the jump, they had to reduce their sample size in order to skew the data in their favor. Of the 79 they accepted, 76 answered risen to question 1 and yes to question 2, and boom, 95% of scientists agree.
And in 2012, we thought, it's been nearly a decade since Naomi Oreskes published her original analysis of peer-reviewed papers. It's time for an update. We looked at 21 years worth of peer-reviewed papers about either global warming or global climate change. The first thing we noticed was that a lot of papers don't even bother to mention whether humans are causing global warming or not. It's like you look at astronomy papers, not many of them would bother mentioning that the Earth revolves around the sun. That's established consensus. We don't need to keep mentioning that.
I also want to say, since we're talking about most scientists, you know, I've heard 97%, 98%. There's a recent paper by John Cook and co-authors who looked at thousands of research papers which have been published in the scientific literature to see what fraction, you know, support the scientific consensus on global warming. Well, it turns out that the 97% consensus that they found, I am indeed part of, and Senator Sessions mentioned he would agree with it too. And my associate, John Christie, he agrees with it. In fact, all skeptics that I know of that work in this business, all are part of that 97%, because the 97% includes people who think humans have some influence on climate. Well, that's a fairly innocuous statement.
A lot of papers don't even bother to mention whether humans are causing global warming or not.
And that's something that continually annoys me, is those of us that are called deniers. It's never actually been pointed out. What is it that we deny? Also, you know, this 97%. Well, what does the 97% consensus mean? You know, what do all of those people agree to? Well, they agree to something fairly innocuous, and it's something that most of us agree to, that humans must have some influence on climate. The question is, how much? And how much influence makes all the difference in the world if you're going to be basing policy decisions, carbon taxes, regulations, legislation, whatever, on them, it makes all the difference in the world exactly how much warming we can expect due to human activities.
Truly, consensus has no place in science anyways, but it does have PR value with the mainstream media. And on the opposite side of the spectrum, if some research is published that goes against it, they're just ignored or forced to be removed. For example, the Oregon petition, in response to the 1997 Kyoto Agreement, was endorsed by over 31,000 scientists, including 9,000 with PhDs in their field. And they stated, there is no convincing scientific evidence that the human release of carbon dioxide, methane, or other greenhouse gases is causing or will, in the foreseeable future, cause catastrophic heating of the Earth's atmosphere and disruption of the Earth's climate. Moreover, there is substantial scientific evidence that increases in atmospheric carbon dioxide produce many beneficial effects upon the natural plant and animal environments of the Earth. The mainstream media, of course, ignored this, and the few stations that addressed it really were just attacking them and telling people that they aren't legitimate, that they're not climate scientists, because just being a scientist isn't enough. Now you need to be sponsored by big money, right? And be a part of the anti-fossil fuel agenda in order to get their special title. Many people really adopt these titles for political sponsors and financial support, right? So they could have all the credentials in the world, but if they don't follow the narrative, they are censored. Another great example would be the 2011 Scientific American Opinion Poll on the state of climate science. With a total of 5,190 scientists who responded, a consensus of 81% think the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is a, quote, corrupt organization prone to groupthink with a political agenda. Scientific America removed the poll when they were pressured by environmental groups. So honesty is not really a value of people who want to alarm others about the climate. If polls or statistics or there's contradictory facts, they just dismiss them. And the whole consensus of 97% is really a convenient fiction used to bypass the scientific method, to sway public opinion, right? To drive societal change through the policy on the other side. Michael Crichton, PhD and MD, famous author, producer, and lecturer, often said about consensus, historically, the claim of consensus is the first refuge of scoundrel. It's a way to avoid debate by claiming the matter is already settled. When you hear the consensus of scientists agrees on something or other, reach for your wallet because you're being had. Let's be clear, the work of science has nothing whatsoever to do with consensus. Consensus is the business of politics. And finally, we should point out that according to numerous scientists, it's not even possible to compute a credible measure of global average surface temperature over a period of, say, the 1900s to date, because the requisite raw data doesn't even exist. NOAA, NASA, and a few other different organizations put out an abridged report in June 2017. And there was a paper by other scientists released on this report called On the Validity of NOAA, NASA, and Hadley Crew Global Average Surface Temperature Data, that despite current claims of record-setting warming, it is impossible to conclude from the NOAA, NASA, and Hadley Crew gas data sets that recent years have been the warmest ever. Peer-reviewed climate science research report has proven that it is all but certain that EPA's basic claim that CO2 is a pollutant is totally false. These are peer-reviewed scientific papers that really is how science is supposed to work. People make claims and they're tested and they're found wanting. But the public isn't shown these things. And I think it's time we start to become more open to and aware of what everyone says on this subject, because now it's time to talk about why this matters.
Because energy is equivalent to work, and because work is equivalent to food and shelter. If you make energy expensive, what you do is you starve the poor. And you don't have to starve them very much before they become desperate and things fall apart, and then we fall into these positive feedback loops. And so when you hear these bloody globalist utopians talk about the necessity for higher energy costs, you remember that comes directly at the cost of the world's poor. Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, 2 weeks ago had the unmitigated and I would say quasi-demonic gall to announce publicly that $8 a gallon gasoline in Canada was actually probably a good thing, because Canadians should be reminded nonstop just how severe the climate crisis is every time they fill up their cars. And that's perfectly bloody fine unless you're living on the edge of your economic capability. And the fact that you can't afford to fill up your car anymore puts you into unemployment and food deprivation in relationship to your children. And that's in the rich West. And now in Europe, we're so goddamn stupid on our energy policy because of these idiot environmental schemes that we've made ourselves pathologically reliant on the Russians. And we're going to bloody well see what that costs us.
Climate alarmism is a fear-based tool that's used to bring massive societal change. If we go back to the first Earth Day in 1970, it was filled with hyperbole and exaggerations about mankind's future on the Earth. One of the most common ideas was that the global food supply would run out because it couldn't keep up with population growth by the year 2000. Peter Guntner, a professor of North Texas University, which is now called the University of North Texas, wrote about how mass starvation was in the world's near-term future. He, of course, was wrong. And other published papers by, say, Human Progress demonstrated how global hunger actually dramatically decreased through this same amount of time. Noel Brown, the director of the New York office of the United Nations Environmental Program, claimed in 1989 that human beings had a mere 10 years to stop the effects of global warming. He pronounced doom for Canada, the United States, all along the East Coast, saying it would be flooded and conditions would be like the 1930s Dust Bowl. This, of course, didn't happen either. There's predictions about the polar ice caps melting, very common. Dramatic pictures of polar bears floating on tiny icebergs, very iconic images for the climate change movement. Former Vice President Al Gore said in a conference in 2009 that scientists predicted a 75% chance that within 5 to 7 years the polar ice caps would be melted. In 2014, the ice caps were still there. It's 2022 and they are still there. This, of course, like all of them, was wrong. Interesting, while the media gives so much attention to even the slightest heat wave, they don't point out how cold waves actually kill 20 times as more people. According to the excess winter mortality, it shows that the number of deaths in the 4 coldest months is much higher than the other 8 months of the year. Now, how many of these people come back and redact their statements and apologize for all the fear-mongering? None of them. And instead, we get really a repackaging of the same narrative based on new findings of the devastation coming to the world. For example, even today, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a self-avowed socialist, recently claimed that the world would end in 12 years if we don't radically transform our economy to combat climate change. I believe that one of the next great players on the world stage is going to be climate change. This single area, I predict, will be one of the biggest reasons for major new legislation. Furthermore, it will bring yet another level of global cooperation, just like we saw with COVID. In last year's presentation, I talked about cryptocurrency and the blockchain and how really it's going to result in a lot of loss of privacy, of purchasing autonomy, and even access to things long-term like the internet. However, in this video, I'm going to say that I think climate change has an even wider scope of what it could change about our lives. Where you can live, how far you can travel, how much food you can buy, how much energy you can use, even how many kids you can have, can all be brought into submission through climate legislation. Calls for harsh environmental restrictions in the name of saving the environment is already being voiced by influential organizations and figures. In November 2020, the Red Cross proclaimed that climate change is a bigger threat than COVID and should be confronted with the, quote, same urgency. Bill Gates recently demanded dramatic measures to prevent climate change, claiming it would be worse than the pandemic. Even former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, said last year predicting that climate deaths would dwarf those of the pandemic. Isn't it interesting how they're all comparing it to that last worldwide crisis? As TheHill.com reported, lockdowns, which significantly reduced carbon emissions during 2020, could be the solution. What would climate lockdowns look like? Most likely, cities and states would begin a gradual and discreet ramp-up of restrictions. During the early days of the pandemic, millions of Americans worked from home. This could become the permanent norm if special carbon taxes are put into place. Such taxes could be imposed on companies, limiting driving or air miles, and extend to individual employees. Drive to work in your car, you get hit with a tax. Children could also be impacted by climate lockdowns too. And what's likely to happen, which we're seeing to a degree already, is that much of this new legislation is a repackaging of old legislation that they weren't able to get through. Even Representative Alexandria Cortez's chief of staff, Sekat Chakrabarti, which I'm sure I didn't say that right, admitted recently the true motives behind the Green New Deal. In Washington, he was in a meeting with Governor Jay Inslee, and he said the interesting thing about the Green New Deal is it wasn't originally a climate thing at all. Do you guys think of it as a climate thing? Because we really think of it as a how do you change the entire economy thing. This is very radical, and there's many things that we could bring up about the consequences it will have, whether it's removing over 3 million workers, raising the cost of energy because clean energy sources are 2 to 5 times more expensive, or just the fact that it's less reliable. I mean, many different things, again, that we could say, but what I want to hone in on is the fact that all of this is towards solving climate change, but it won't even solve climate change. As Bjorn Lomborg explains in his book, False Alarm, how climate change panic costs us millions, hurts the poor, and fails to fix the planet, the way it's proposed to fix climate change is essentially throwing tons of money at it and not achieving very much. To make any impact would require trillions of dollars every year, and people simply aren't going to vote for those guys. It won't solve the problem. Even if America were to cut all its carbon emissions tomorrow and going forward, by the end of this century, it would only reduce the Earth's temperature by 0.03 Fahrenheit. And it's a great point that are people really going to vote in legislation that's going to cost them more and be less reliable? Probably not. And that's why climate alarmism seems to make a lot of sense, because it's probably the only way they'll be able to get people to vote for them, or to let these legislations just be forcibly applied on them. Interesting to note here, Doggerland, Atepa, Papua New Guinea, Hamresenden, Norway, Anatolia and Turkey, all of these ancient civilizations were said to be wiped out by rising sea levels, flooding, droughts. There's evidence in history that the patterns of weather which have affected mankind has always been going on this way to a degree. It's only today, whether it's man-made or not, that we have people who want to use and leverage these catastrophes for their own political and religious agendas.
South Asia is one of the world's global climate crisis hotspots. People living in these hotspots are 15 times more likely to die from climate impacts. As we continue to see more and more extreme weather events around the world, it is outrageous that climate action is being put on the back burner as global emissions of greenhouse gases are still rising, putting all of us, everywhere, in growing danger.
So I want to say thank you to Take on the World for having me here. I hope this video has blessed you guys and given you some great information. If you want to keep up with me, find me in my social channels, give me a follow, and hey, I hope all of you have a great night.